The October sky hung gray, as a wet blanket, over a valley dying of thirst. They buried her husband on a Tuesday. She didn't cry. The whole town saw that, and the whole town had already decided what kind of woman that made her. They didn't know she'd cried herself hollow 3 nights running, alone, in a rented room at the end of the street. 2 days later, she sold the wagon, sold the mule, sold everything she owned, and took $41 to buy a cliff nobody had touched in 11 years. People laughed. Then people stopped laughing when they watched her cut into that rock with her own 2 hands, day after day, until her fingers split open and the stone began to give. But somebody had once offered 10 times the price for that ground. Cash, laid flat on the table, turned down, and then he vanished from the county that same season without a word of explanation. Nobody knew why. On the last night of July, 4 torches climbed the slope. She set down the hammer and walked to the edge. They buried Thaddeus Doyle on a Tuesday. Cold ground, colder sky, the kind of gray that sits on a person's shoulders like a hand that refuses to let go. Cordelia Doyle stood at the edge of the grave, with her spine straight and her eyes dry, which people noticed, which people talked about, later, over stew and coffee, in the particular hushed voices reserved for judging a woman who wasn't in the room to defend herself. A wife who doesn't cry at her own husband's funeral. Something wrong with her. Something cold. They didn't know she'd already cried herself hollow. 3 nights running. Alone. In the back room of the rented house on Cooper Street, with baby Wren asleep against her chest, and Ezra pretending, badly, not to hear her, through the thin wall between their rooms. She'd cried until there wasn't anything left inside her to cry with. Until crying itself felt like drawing water from a well already scraped dry. By the time they lowered Thaddeus into the ground, she was just standing there. Empty. Steady. Because empty and steady, it turns out, look exactly the same from the outside. Nobody can tell the difference just by watching a woman's face. Ezra stood beside her, 14 years old, already taller than she was, which still surprised her some mornings, the way he kept sneaking up on his own height. He wore his dead brother-in-law's old coat, because it was the only thing warm enough for the wind, and it hung wrong on him. Too big through the shoulders, which made him look like a boy playing dress-up in a dead man's clothes. Which he was. Which nobody said out loud, because some cruelties are only cruel if you name them. Wren slept through the whole thing. 6 weeks old, wrapped tight against her mother's body, entirely unaware that the world had just tilted sideways and had no intention of coming back level. There is a mercy in being that small, a mercy Cordelia envied, with an intensity that frightened her a little. The Reverend said words. People bowed their heads. And then it was done. That should have been the hard part. The burying. It wasn't. The hard part came after, in the yard behind the Kessler house, where half of Larkspur Flat gathered for the funeral supper, with their casseroles and their condolences, and, underneath all of it, barely hidden, their opinions. Because everyone in Larkspur Flat had an opinion about Cordelia Doyle, and everyone, it seemed, had already decided what should happen to her next. Nora Kessler found her first, took both her hands, held them a beat too tight, the way you hold something you're afraid might slip away if you don't grip hard enough. You know there's a room for you here, Nora said. You and the boy and the baby. Long as you need it. That's kind, Cordelia said. You could work the kitchen. I've needed help since. I appreciate it. It's safe, Cordelia. It's stable. Stable. As though Cordelia were a horse that needed pinning before it hurt itself. I'll think on it, Cordelia said. Which was a lie. Which Nora probably knew was a lie. But it was the kind of lie that let both of them walk away from the conversation without a fight. And so it did the only job a lie like that has to do. Then came Barnaby Pruitt. He found her by the fire an hour later. Broad man in his 50s. Ran the dry goods store on Main Street, and had appointed himself, somewhere along the way, that nobody could quite remember agreeing to, the voice of Larkspur Flat's common sense. He didn't offer condolences first. He never did anything first that wasn't business. That was simply the shape of him. Heard you're selling the wagon, he said. I am. And the mule. That too. He studied her the way he studied a ledger that refused to balance. That's everything you have. More or less. So what happens after? She looked at him steady. I'm buying the Hallow Ridge property. Silence. Not the polite kind. The kind with weight to it. The kind that makes a fire crackle louder just to fill the gap. Pruitt's eyebrows climbed like she'd spoken in a language he didn't recognize. The cliffland. Out past the eastern rim. That one. Cordelia. He said her name like a warning shot fired across a bow. That ground sat empty 11 years. Nobody's touched it. You can't farm rock. You can't build on a slope that steep. There's maybe 2 inches of soil, where there's any soil at all, and the nearest water's half a mile down the grade. I know. You know. My grandfather surveyed that land. Back in 47. Wrote about it for years. He thought it had real promise. Pruitt's jaw worked like he was chewing something too tough to swallow. Your grandfather, he said slowly, was considered by most folks in this county to be. He stopped himself. Eccentric, Cordelia finished for him. I know what they called him. I was going to say hopeful. You weren't. He didn't argue that. He didn't have it in him to argue that. Cordelia, you're 19 years old. You buried your husband 3 hours ago. This is not the day to be building your whole future off a dead man's notebooks. She looked at him a long moment. Long enough that he shifted his weight. Uncomfortable, the way a man shifts, when he said something he already suspects he can't take back. Thank you for coming today, Mr. Pruitt, she said, and walked away. She bought Hallow Ridge 2 days later for $41. Every cent the wagon, and the mule had brought her, minus what she'd carefully set aside for flour and beans and lamp oil. Enough to last 3 months, if she was careful. And she was always careful. Careful was the only luxury the world had left her. The county recorder's office smelled like dust and old paper, and the particular silence of a room where important, boring things happen without ceremony. The clerk was a thin young man named Everett Kane, new to the job, still nervous about doing something wrong on the wrong day. He looked at the property description, looked at her, looked at the description again, as though a third reading might change what it said. Ma'am, he said, careful, like he was handling glass. This is the Hallow Ridge parcel. I know what it is. There was interest in this land before. Years back. She paused with the pen still in her hand. What kind of interest? Everett hesitated, glanced toward the back office like he was checking whether he was allowed to say what he was about to say. A man came through. Must have been, I don't know, 8, 9 years ago. Before my time here, but old Mr. Halloran told me about it once. This fellow offered 10 times what the land was worth. 10 times. Cash on the table. Owner turned him down flat. Cordelia went very still. Turned him down. Yes, ma'am. Why? Nobody knows. Owner packed up that same season. Left the county. Never came back. Land's been sitting empty since. Everett shrugged. Uneasy, as though he already regretted starting this particular conversation. Just seemed odd to me. A man walks away from 10 times the value of something. That's not a man who thinks the land's worthless. Cordelia looked down at the deed in front of her. $41. Somebody, once, had been willing to pay $410. She signed the deed anyway. Everett stamped it, handed it back, watched her walk out of the office, with an expression sitting somewhere between concern and disbelief, the particular look reserved for people about to do something everyone else already knows won't work. By noon, half the town knew what she'd done. By sundown, the whole town did. She heard them before she saw them. Voices carrying through the open window of the laundry on Main Street, while she and Ezra loaded the last of their belongings onto a borrowed handcart. Grief does that, one woman said. Makes folks go simple. It's not grief, another voice answered. That girl was always strange. Remember how she used to carry rocks around? As a child? Naming them. Telling anybody who'd listen what kind of stone they were. Somebody ought to stop her. She's got a baby now. And the boy, Ezra, carrying a crate of his grandfather's books, stopped walking. His jaw went tight in the way it did when he was trying very hard not to feel something in front of witnesses. Don't, Cordelia said, not looking up from the rope she was tying. I wasn't going to do anything. You were thinking about it. He set the crate down harder than he needed to. They're not wrong, that it's going to be hard. It's going to be very hard. She pulled the rope tight, knotted it. Hand me that end. He handed it to her. Grandpa really believed in that ground. Ezra asked. He surveyed the whole eastern rim 3 times. Said the rock face had the right kind of layering. Sandstone over limestone. Natural fracture lines you could work with the right tools if you knew how to read them. She smoothed her palm over the crate of notebooks like she was calming something alive underneath the canvas. He said there were water seams underneath that surfaced lower down the slope. He said. She stopped, because saying it out loud made it real, and real was heavier than she was ready to carry, standing here beside a borrowed cart, with a sleeping baby on her chest, and a whole town already writing the ending of her story before she'd had the chance to live through the middle of it. He said most people look at a cliff, she finished, and see everything they can't do with it. He looked at the same cliff and saw what hadn't been done yet. Ezra was quiet a moment. He also kept 14 cats and talked to the moon. Yes, Cordelia said. He did. But he wasn't wrong about the rock. The track up to Hallow Ridge wasn't a road. It was barely a suggestion, a scar carved into the hillside by whatever feet had wandered up there over the years, mostly curious people who came to look and then went home shaking their heads, satisfied they'd confirmed something they'd already decided. The slope was steep, loose gravel, dead October grass, brittle underfoot. By the time Cordelia and Ezra had wrestled the handcart halfway up, her arms were burning, and Rin was crying against her chest, hungry and tired, and far too small to know or care that her mother was in the middle of remaking their entire lives on a hillside nobody else wanted. They stopped at a wide ledge 2/3 of the way up, a natural shelf, maybe 30 feet across, where the slope eased, before the cliff face rose straight up behind it, gray and patient and enormous. South-facing. That was the first thing Cordelia noted. The first thing her grandfather had noted, decades before, in handwriting she could trace, with her eyes closed, if she had to. South-facing. Full sun. Protected from the north wind by the cliff itself. She stood there, with Rin fussing against her shoulder, and looked out at the valley below. Larkspur Flat, small and gray under the low October sky. Rooftops. The white spire of the church. The brown ribbon of the creek that had given the town its name a generation before anyone standing on this ledge had been born. It looked almost pretty from up here. She knew what lived underneath that prettiness. Clay-heavy soil. A water table that had been dropping every dry summer for a decade, according to her grandfather's notes. A whole town sitting on ground that was slowly, quietly, running out of the one thing it couldn't live without, and not one of them looking up to notice. What do you think? Ezra asked, coming to stand beside her, breathing hard from the climb. She turned and studied the cliff face. 30 feet at its tallest. Sandstone-colored, banded in horizontal layers like the pages of a book nobody in this county had ever bothered to open. Natural recesses already carved into it by wind and time, patient work older than any of them. Fracture lines running vertical, exactly where Jonas Hargrove had sketched them on a survey map 30 years before either of them had drawn breath. I think, she said slowly, we're going to be all right. Ezra looked at the ledge, at the cliff, at the single canvas tarp they'd brought to sleep under, until something better could be built. At his sister, 19 years old, holding a crying infant, standing on a rock shelf, with everything she owned in a handcart and nothing in her pocket but 40 cents and a dead man's notebooks. If you say so, he said. He didn't sound convinced. He also didn't argue. They made camp, that first night, with a small fire against the cliff face to bounce the heat back at them. Beans out of a pot. Not much. Wind came up, after dark, and shook the tarp like it meant to tear it clean off the world. Cordelia lay awake, with Ren finally quiet against her, listening to the canvas snap and pull, and she went through her grandfather's notebooks from memory. The way she'd been doing, since she was 12 years old, sitting cross-legged at his feet, while he talked about ancient people who'd carved their homes into cliffsides on the other side of the world. Systems that had lasted centuries, while empires around them crumbled to dust. Rock, water, heat, time. Get those 4 things right, he used to say, tapping the table, with one crooked finger for emphasis, and everything else becomes solvable. She lay under the shaking canvas and thought, rock, water, heat, time. And underneath that thought, quieter, the thing she hadn't said to Ezra. The thing about the stranger who'd once offered 10 times the price for this land, and then simply vanished. Why would somebody pay that much for worthless ground? Why would they walk away from it after? She didn't have an answer. Not yet. But the question sat in her chest like a stone she'd swallowed whole, and it refused to dissolve. Not that night. Not for a long time after. She started on the rock before the week was out. Not the big work. Not yet. First, she needed to understand the cliff the way her grandfather had taught her to understand anything worth understanding. Slowly, with her hands, without deciding ahead of time what she was going to find, because deciding first was how a person missed what was actually there. She went along the face, with her fingers, feeling texture, pressing at fracture lines to test their depth. She tapped with the handle of a small geologist's hammer that had been her grandfather's, listening to the sound the stone gave back. Hollow in some places, solid in others. Every tap a small conversation, with something that had been waiting a very long time for somebody to ask it a question. Ezra watched her for 2 days, without saying much. On the third day, he picked up a chisel and started copying her, a few feet down the face. "What am I listening for?" he asked. "A sound like knocking on a good door," she said. "Solid. Dense. That's where we don't carve. We're looking for the in-between, where the stone's softer but still sound." He tapped, listened, tapped again. "Here?" She came over, tapped the same spot. "Yes, just there." He marked it, with chalk, the way she'd shown him. "How deep does Grandpa say we can go?" "Into the fracture line, maybe 12 feet. We're not digging a mine, Ezra. We're shaping what's already here." It took them 3 weeks to open the first chamber. Slow work, brutal work, chiseling and hammering for hours at a stretch, clearing broken stone by hand, arms and shoulders screaming by nightfall in a way that made sleep both desperately needed and hard to find. 2-hour stretches. Rest. Go again. Cordelia kept a log of every inch they advanced. Which tools worked on which layer? Which angle held? Which one didn't? Numbers on a page, plain and unglamorous. The only kind of proof this hillside would accept. And the whole time, people watched from the track below. At first just curious. Standing there with a hand shading their eyes, the way you'd watch a house fire, from a safe distance, not sure whether to feel sorry or entertained. Then not so shy about it. There was a man, from town, Cyrus Tate, who ran the feed store and had a voice that carried like a brass bell across an empty church, who called up one afternoon while they were working. "How's the hole coming, Mrs. Doyle?" Ezra's jaw went tight again. Cordelia kept chiseling. "My wife wants to know if you need candles," Tate called, "for the cave you're living in." Laughter. 2 men beside him, laughing along. The easy laughter of people who've found something to feel superior about and intend to enjoy it fully. She set her chisel down. Worked another 10 minutes before she responded at all, because reacting fast is exactly what people expect, and she had already decided, somewhere on that first cold night under the tarp, that she was finished doing what people expected of her. She climbed down, walked right up to him, looked at him with a calm that seemed, immediately, to unsettle him more than shouting ever could have. "Mr. Tate," she said, "how's the water table under your south field this year?" He blinked. "What?" "The clay layer runs shallow on that side. Maybe 15 feet down. Last dry summer, I'd guess your well dropped by half. Am I close?" He stared at her. "What's that got to do with anything?" "Nothing," she said pleasantly. "I'm just curious about the geology." She turned, climbed back up. Behind her, she heard him mutter something low to the men beside him. She didn't catch the words. Didn't care to. Ezra had heard the whole thing. "What was the point of that?" he asked when she got back. "No point," she said, picking up her chisel again. "I just wanted him to think." By the end of November, the first chamber was roughed in. 8 feet wide, 11 deep, 6.5 at its tallest, tight, but workable. The back wall still rough. The ceiling uneven, but enclosed on 3 sides by solid rock, framed at the open face, with timber salvaged from a collapsed barn on the lower slope, wood that had once sheltered someone else's animals, and now, patched and reset, would shelter her children instead. It wasn't comfortable. It was warm. The stone held the day's heat through the night in a way that reading about it in a notebook had never fully prepared her for. Lying in it at midnight, with the outside air well below freezing, was a different kind of education entirely. The body learns things the mind only suspects. "It works," Ezra said one morning, sitting up in his blankets, touching the wall like he still didn't quite trust it. "It's why cliff dwellings hold up in extreme places," Cordelia said, already up, feeding the small fire by the door. The stone stabilizes the temperature. You don't fight the weather. You let the rock absorb it. He sat there a moment, palm flat on the wall. All right, he said. I believe you. She looked at him. You didn't before? He had the grace to look embarrassed. I believed you believed it. That's different. She laughed. First time since the funeral. The sound surprised her, not because it felt wrong, but because it felt like something she'd forgotten she still had inside her, buried under all that careful, steady grief. They were not entirely alone up there, though the help, when it came, arrived from directions she hadn't expected. Amos Whitcomb was 73 years old and had been a stonemason before his knees finally gave out on him for good. He came up the track one gray December afternoon, cane in one hand, a face full of skepticism, and no greeting at all, as though greetings were a luxury he'd stopped affording years ago. Let me see what you're doing, he said. She showed him, walked him through the first chamber, explained her approach to the fracture lines, showed him the sketches from her grandfather's notebooks, worn soft at the edges from years of small hands turning them. He listened without speaking, bent now and then to look closer, his breathing rough from the climb, the sound of a man doing something his body had officially retired from. When she finished, he was quiet a long time. Your grandfather was right about the fracture lines, he said finally. Most men would have tried to blast this, shattered the surrounding rock, left you with a pile of rubble and a headache. Working the natural breaks is slower. He looked up at the ceiling, studying it the way a doctor studies a wound. But it holds. He tapped his cane against the entrance frame. You need to keystone the top of this before it gets any heavier, or it drops on you. I know, Cordelia said. I've been trying to work out the angle. I'll show you. He came back the next day, and the day after that. He never stayed long. His knees wouldn't allow it. But what he taught her in those short visits was worth more than 2 weeks of trial and error done alone. How to cut a proper keystone arch. How much rock thickness to leave between chambers so the whole thing didn't collapse on their heads while they slept. How to read the stone for the places that would surprise you if you weren't paying close enough attention. Why are you helping me? She asked him one afternoon, the two of them sitting on the ledge sharing bread. He chewed slowly. Because nobody else is. He took another bite. And because your grandfather was the only man in this county who ever talked to me like I knew what I was doing. He looked out at the valley, at the small gray town below. Also, if you manage to pull off what you're attempting, I'd like to have seen it. Which brings us to Boone McCrae, which is the part of this story Cordelia never quite saw coming, not the way it actually came. He rode up the track for the first time on a cold morning in early December, sitting a tired gray gelding, wearing a duster gone thin at the shoulders and a hat pulled low against the wind. Cordelia heard the hoofbeats before she saw him. Felt her whole body go still, the particular stillness of a woman alone on a hillside, with a baby and a boy, and no one close enough to hear her, if something went wrong. She picked up the hammer. Didn't hide it. Didn't need to. Just held it. He stopped the horse at the base of the ledge. Didn't come up further without being asked. That, she noted. That told her something worth knowing. Ma'am, he said. Didn't mean to startle you. You didn't. Which was a lie. A small one. The kind you tell to keep the upper hand in a conversation you didn't ask to be having. He sat there a moment, looking up at the chamber, at the timber frame, at the roughed-out terrace lines already scratched into the slope below it. Heard in town somebody was building something up here, he said. Didn't believe it till I saw it. Now you've seen it. Now I've seen it. He didn't say anything else for a moment. Just looked. And there was something in the way he looked. Not pity, not mockery. Something else, something closer to a man doing arithmetic in his head, and not liking where the numbers led, that made Cordelia lower the hammer, just slightly. You work for Callaway, she said. It wasn't a question. His horse wore the Circle C brand on its saddle blanket, and everybody in this valley knew exactly what that meant. I do. Long way from the Callaway range. Wasn't headed anywhere in particular. He looked at the sky, just riding, which was also a lie. She could tell. She was getting good at recognizing lies, her own and other people's, in the short weeks since the funeral. Grief does that to a person. Strips away all patience for anything that isn't the plain, unadorned truth. Well, she said, you've seen it. You can ride on and tell whoever wants to know that the widow Doyle's gone and lost her mind. Save yourself another trip. Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite a smile. Close to one. Didn't say I thought that. You didn't say you didn't. He was quiet a beat. That first chamber, he said, nodding up at it. Your keystone's cut wrong on the north side. Angle's off by a few degrees. It'll hold through winter. Might not hold through a wet spring. Cordelia felt something tighten low in her stomach. Not fear exactly. The particular sting of being told something true by a stranger she'd rather not need. Wickham cut that angle. Wickham's a fine mason. Man's also 70-some years old, and can't climb a ladder to check his own work anymore. Boone shrugged, like the observation cost him nothing to make. Just telling you what I see. And what would you know about it? Grew up on a spread, with a root cellar cut into limestone. Watched my father rebuild that keystone 3 times before he finally got it right. He tipped his head toward the chamber again. You want? I could take a look. Won't cost you anything but the time. Cordelia stood there, hammer at her side, wind pulling at her skirt, and looked at this stranger on a tired horse, who worked for a man she'd never met, and had no reason on earth to help her. Why would you do that? He was quiet a moment, long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer at all. Don't rightly know, he said finally. Guess I don't much like watching something get built wrong, when I know exactly how to build it right. It wasn't an answer that explained anything. It was, somehow, exactly enough. Fine, she said. Look at it. Don't touch anything without asking first. Yes, ma'am. He swung down off the horse. And that was the beginning of it, though neither of them called it that at the time, not for a long while after. He came back 3 days later, then 4 days after that. Never announced himself beforehand. Never explained why he kept finding reasons to ride the long way around his patrol route, a route that happened, every time, to pass close enough to Hallow Ridge that a man could climb up, fix a keystone angle, and climb back down, before anybody in Larkspur Flat noticed his horse had been gone longer than duty required. Ezra was suspicious of him at first, which Cordelia understood, without needing it explained. A 14-year-old boy who'd already lost one father figure wasn't eager to let a stranger fill that space again, even a little, even sideways. But Boone treated Ezra like a person who knew things, didn't talk down to him, asked him questions about the fracture lines, and actually waited, patiently, for the answers. You've got a good eye, Boone told him one afternoon, watching Ezra chalk a mark on the rock face, without needing to be shown twice. Ezra tried not to look pleased. Didn't quite manage it. By the 3rd week, Ezra had stopped watching Boone like a threat and started watching him like a teacher. Cordelia noticed that too. Filed it away carefully, the way she filed away most things that mattered. Didn't say anything about it. It was on one of those afternoons, deep in December, cold enough that their breath hung visible in the air between them, that Cordelia finally asked the question she'd been carrying since the recorder's office. Boone. He looked up from the chisel he was setting. Somebody offered 10 times the price for this land. Years back. Before I bought it. She watched his face carefully when she said it. You ever hear anything about that? Something crossed his expression. Fast. Gone before she could be entirely certain she'd seen it at all. No, he said. Can't say I have. You sure? I've only worked the Callaway Range for years, ma'am. Wasn't around for whatever happened before that. It was a careful answer. She noticed that too. The way he'd answered the question she asked, and not the one underneath it. The one about whether Reeves Callaway himself might have been the man who'd once wanted this ridge badly enough to offer $400 for dirt everybody else called worthless. She let it sit. Didn't push. Not yet. But that night, lying under the tarp, with Wren finally asleep, and Ezra's breathing gone slow, and even beside her, she thought about it again. The man who'd offered 10 times the price. The man who'd walked away and vanished from the county entirely. The same season he was turned down flat. Something about that didn't sit right in her chest, low and persistent, like a splinter she couldn't quite locate. Because it felt like the first loose thread on a coat that was about to come apart at the seams if she pulled on it hard enough. Except she wasn't ready yet. Except pulling too soon might tear the wrong thing entirely. She didn't pull. She just noted it, the way her grandfather had taught her to note anything worth noting. Slowly, without deciding ahead of time what she was going to find. Christmas came and went with little ceremony. A small fire, bread and dried apples. Ezra had carved Wren a wooden rattle out of a scrap of the barn timber, and the sound of it, small, rhythmic, impossibly ordinary, was the closest thing to celebration the ledge saw that winter. Boone rode up on Christmas Eve, didn't say why, brought a sack of coffee beans and a length of good rope, set them down, without ceremony, and said he'd heard supplies might be running thin this time of year. You didn't have to do that, Cordelia said. Didn't say I had to. He stayed an hour, sat by the fire, watched Wren sleep in the crook of Cordelia's arm, with an expression she couldn't quite read, something careful, something that looked, if she was honest, with herself, a little bit like a man watching something he wanted badly, and had already decided he probably couldn't have. He left before dark, said he needed to be back before his absence got noticed. Calloway keep that close an eye on his men? Cordelia asked. Boone's jaw tightened. Just slightly. Just enough that she saw it happen. Calloway keeps a close eye on everything, he said. That's sort of the whole trouble with him. He didn't explain further. Swung up onto his horse. Rode off down the track into the dark. Cordelia stood there a long moment, after the hoofbeats faded, watching the place, where he'd disappeared, into the tree line, and thought, there's a story in that man she hadn't heard yet. And underneath that thought, another one, quieter. There's a story in Reeves Calloway too, and it's tangled up somewhere, with a stranger who once offered 10 times the value of a worthless cliff, and then disappeared, without a word. She didn't know, yet how those two threads connected. She only knew, standing there in the cold, with her daughter asleep against her chest, that they did. January brought the town's opinions right up the hillside, with the wind, carrying them all the way to her door whether she wanted them or not. It started small. A group of 3, standing on the track below one gray afternoon, watching Cordelia and Ezra work the second chamber. Talking loud enough to be heard, not loud enough to be answered, without climbing down first, which was, of course, precisely the point. Cliff which, one of them said. Cordelia recognized the voice. Dutch Briggs, who farmed 40 acres on the north side of the valley, and had never once, in 3 years of Cordelia living in this town, said a single kind word to her that she could remember. That's what my wife's calling her, Dutch went on, loud, performing for the 2 men beside him. Cliff Witch and her cave of misfit children. Ezra's chisel stopped moving. Cordelia's did not. Somebody ought to send for the county, Dutch said. Woman's got no business raising a baby in a hole in the rock. It's not natural. Cordelia set her chisel down, wiped her hands on her apron, climbed down the ledge path, slow, unhurried, the way you walk towards something you've already decided you're not afraid of. Dutch watched her come, with the particular smugness of a man who thinks he's about to be proven right about something he's suspected all along. Mr. Briggs, she said. Mrs. Doyle. He tipped his hat, mocking, exaggerated. How's your north while holding up this winter? He blinked. The smugness flickered, just slightly. What's that to you? Just curious. Your land sits on the same clay shelf as Tate's. I'd guess you've had trouble keeping that well primed the last 2 summers. Am I wrong? Dutch's face went through several things at once, none of them comfortable to watch happen. That's none of your business. No, Cordelia agreed. It isn't. Same as my daughter's not yours. She turned, started back up the path. You won't last the winter up there. Dutch called after her, his voice cracking, with something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite fear either. You'll come crawling back down here begging for help, same as anybody, with sense would have done, from the start. Cordelia didn't turn around. Grab that chisel. Ezra, she said, loud enough to carry. We've got another 6 inches to clear before dark. Behind her, she heard Dutch say something low to the men beside him. She didn't catch the words. She didn't need to. That night, Ezra sat across the fire, from her, turning a piece of scrap wood over in his hands, not carving it, just holding it the way you hold something to keep your hands from shaking. Does it bother you? He asked. What they say? Cordelia thought about that a long moment before answering, because the honest answer was complicated, and Ezra deserved the honest answer, not the easy one. Yes, she said. It bothers me. He looked up, surprised. She'd never admitted that plainly before, not to him, not out loud. But being bothered by it, and letting it stop me, she said, those are 2 different things. Grandpa used to say the same about the men who laughed at his surveys. He'd come home from the county meetings looking like somebody had taken a whip to him, and then he'd sit right back down at his desk the next morning and keep writing anyway. Why? Because being right takes longer than being liked. She poked at the fire. And I'd rather be right in 20 years than liked tomorrow. Ezra was quiet a while. I hit Dutch's boy once, he admitted. Back in the fall, before we moved up here. He said something about Pa. I hit him, and I got in trouble for it, and I never told you why. Cordelia looked at him. I'm not sorry, Ezra said. I know I'm supposed to be. I'm not. I'm not asking you to be. He looked at her, surprised again. You're allowed to be angry, Ezra. You're allowed to feel every bit of what you're feeling. What you're not allowed to do is let it run you off this ridge before we've finished what we came up here to build. She met his eyes across the fire. That's the difference between us and them. They react. We build. He nodded slowly, went back to turning the wood over in his hands. Outside the chamber, the wind picked up, throwing loose snow against the timber frame, and somewhere down in the dark valley below, the lights of Larkspur Flat flickered on one by one, small and distant, and, for the first time since the funeral, exactly as far away as Cordelia wanted them to be. February brought Boone back, with news that made Cordelia go still in a different way than she had, that first cold morning in December. He came up on a Sunday afternoon, off the clock, or as off the clock as a man like Boone McCrae ever really was. He didn't dismount right away, sat there on the gray gelding, looking at her, and something in his face told her, before he said a single word, that whatever he'd come to say, he hadn't wanted to be the one to carry it up this hill. What is it? Cordelia said. Not a question. A demand, gentle but firm. Calloway asked about you last night. Cordelia's hands went still on the chisel she was holding. Asked what? Asked who was working the ridge property. Asked how far along the building was. Asked, Boone hesitated. Asked whether the deed was recorded clean. Whether there was any chance it could be contested. Contested? Cordelia's voice came out flatter than she'd meant it to. On what grounds? Didn't say. Wasn't asking me for legal opinions, ma'am. Was asking me, because I'm the man who rides that stretch of range, and he figured I might have seen something worth reporting. What did you tell him? Boone met her eyes. Told him I hadn't seen much of anything up here worth mentioning. Which was, Cordelia understood immediately, another lie. A bigger one this time. The kind of lie a man tells when he's already chosen a side and hasn't quite said so out loud yet, not even to himself. Why would Calloway care about a worthless cliff 11 years nobody wanted? Boone was quiet a long moment. Long enough that the gray gelding shifted its weight, impatient, and somewhere below on the slope, Ezra's chisel kept tapping against stone, steady, unaware that up here on the ledge something important was happening in the silence between two people who weren't yet saying everything they knew. I don't know, Boone said finally. I genuinely don't. But I've worked that man's range for years, and I've learned exactly one thing about Reeves Calloway in all that time. What's that? He doesn't ask questions about things he doesn't already want. He said it plain. No embellishment. Just a fact laid down between them like a stone set carefully on a scale. Cordelia looked past him, down the slope, down toward the valley, where the Circle C range sprawled out along the northern hills, fat with grass and cattle and water that never seemed to run short, not even in the driest part of summer, not even when every other well in the county was dropping by the week. Water that never ran short. The thought landed and sat there like something she'd known for while without letting herself fully know it. Boone, she said slowly, where does the Circle C draw its water from? He looked at her, and something passed behind his eyes, not surprise exactly. Recognition. The look of a man watching somebody else arrive, entirely on their own, at a place he'd already been standing for longer than he wanted to admit. The High Creek, he said, runs down off the eastern rim. The eastern rim. Cordelia's voice had gone very quiet. This rim. Yes, ma'am. Neither of them said anything else for a long moment. The wind moved through the dead grass on the slope below. Somewhere, Wren fussed in her basket inside the chamber. A small sound, easily missed, and Cordelia realized her hands were shaking, just slightly, around the handle of the chisel. Because a man had once offered $400 for a worthless cliff. Because that same cliff sat directly above the water source that fed the biggest cattle operation in the county. Because Reeves Calloway was asking careful questions about a deed he had no legal reason on earth to care about. Which meant, and she felt the shape of this thought arrive whole, unwelcome, undeniable, which meant this land had never been worthless at all, which meant somebody had known exactly what it was worth for a very long time, and had been counting, quietly, patiently, on nobody else ever figuring it out first. Boone, ma'am, I need you to tell me the truth. All of it. Whatever you know. He was quiet a moment, and when he spoke, his voice had dropped low, the way a man's voice drops right before he crosses a line he can't walk back from. I don't know all of it, he said. I want you to hear that first. I don't know all of it. But I know Calloway's had men riding this stretch of the rim for years, long before you bought it, and I always figured they were just checking on stray cattle. He shook his head slowly. Didn't think much of it till you started digging into that rock, and he started asking questions the same week. You think he wants this land? I think, Boone said, choosing his words, with obvious care. A man doesn't ask whether a deed can be contested unless he's already decided he wants what's sitting on the other side of it. Cordelia stood there on the ledge, the wind pulling at her hair, the cliff rising cold and gray behind her, and felt something settle into place inside her chest. Not fear exactly. Something colder and steadier than fear. Because if Reeves Calloway wanted Hallow Ridge badly enough to send a man asking questions about her deed, then Hallow Ridge was worth wanting. And if it was worth wanting, then everything her grandfather had written across 17 notebooks that half a county had laughed at for 30 years wasn't the rambling of an old fool talking to the moon. It was a map to something Reeves Calloway had been quietly protecting for longer than Cordelia had been alive to notice. Ezra, she called down the slope, her voice steadier than she actually felt. Come up here. Now. He climbed up, wiping stone dust off his hands, looking between his sister and the man on the horse, with the particular alertness of a boy who'd learned, over the last 3 months, to read a room fast. What's happened? Cordelia looked at her brother, at the baby sleeping just inside the chamber behind them, at the cliff rising up, over all 3 of them, solid and patient and, she now understood, worth a great deal more than any of them had known when they'd first climbed up here, with nothing but a handcart and a dead man's notebooks. Nothing's happened yet, she said, but I think something's about to. She looked back at Boone, still mounted, still watching her, with that careful, unreadable expression she was beginning, despite every instinct telling her not to trust anyone connected to Reeves Calloway, to trust anyway. You should go, she said, before you're missed. He nodded, gathered his reins, but he didn't ride off right away. He sat there a moment longer, looking at her the way he had, that first cold morning in December, like a man doing arithmetic and not liking the answer. Except this time there was something else in it too, something that hadn't been there before. Cordelia. It was the first time he'd used her given name. She noticed it the way a person notices a door opening somewhere inside a house they thought was empty. Whatever this turns into, he said, whatever Calloway's got planned, I want you to know I didn't come up here the first time because he sent me. I know that. I came up here because I wanted to see if the stories were true. About the widow building a home into a rock nobody else wanted. He paused. They weren't stories. They were just you, doing the thing everybody said couldn't be done. Cordelia didn't answer right away. The wind moved between them, cold and steady, carrying the smell of wood smoke and turned earth and the particular mineral scent of stone that had become, in 3 short months, the smell of home. Thank you, she said finally, for telling me the truth today, even the part you weren't sure you should tell. He tipped his hat, the smallest motion. Yes, ma'am. And then he turned the gray gelding and rode back down the track into the gathering dusk, back toward a ranch and a boss and a life that Cordelia understood now, with a clarity settling cold and certain in her chest, was about to collide with hers in ways neither one of them had chosen and neither one of them could stop. That night, after Ezra was asleep and Wren was fed and quiet, Cordelia sat by the fire, with her grandfather's 17th notebook open on her knees, the one she'd read. So many times the pages had gone soft, as cloth in places, the ink worn nearly to whisper. She turned to the pages about the eastern rim, about the water seams running under Hallow Ridge that surfaced lower down the slope, about the underground limestone shelf that fed not just her own small cistern site, but, she saw it now, saw it the way you finally see a picture resolve out of scattered dots once somebody shows you exactly where to look, the entire eastern watershed running down through the Circle C range, giving Reeves Calloway's cattle water even in the driest years, while every small farm in the valley below watched their own wells drop and never understood why. Her grandfather had known. 30 years ago, an old man everyone called eccentric had walked this ridge with a survey compass and a notebook and understood exactly what it controlled. And somebody, she was almost certain now, who had understood it too, had tried to buy the silence of that understanding for $400, had failed when the owner, before her, refused to sell and then vanished instead, carrying whatever he knew clean out of the county with him. Cordelia closed the notebook, held it against her chest the way she might have held Wren. Outside, the wind kept moving across the ledge, patient, indifferent, the same wind that had been blowing across this cliff for longer than any of them. Her, Ezra, Boone, Calloway, even her grandfather, had been alive to feel it against their skin. She thought about Dutch Briggs, calling her a witch, from the safety of the valley floor. She thought about Barnaby Pruitt, telling her this wasn't the day to build a future on a dead man's notebooks. She thought about Reeves Calloway, a man she had never once met, asking quiet questions about a deed he had no business caring about at all. And she thought, with something that was not quite triumph and not quite fear, but sat somewhere close to both of them at once. They don't know yet. None of them know yet what's really sitting up here on this ridge. But they will. She banked the fire low, lay down beside her sleeping children, one small and new, one nearly grown, both of them hers to protect now in a world that had already tried, more than once, to decide her fate, without asking her a single question first. Outside, the stars came out cold and clear over Larkspur Flat, over the dry creek bed, over a ranch full of cattle drinking water nobody down in that valley understood the true source of. And on the ledge, in the dark, in the quiet, Cordelia Doyle lay awake a long while, turning over everything she now knew and everything she still didn't, feeling the shape of something large and dangerous beginning to take form just beyond the edge of what she could see clearly. Rock, water, heat, time. Her grandfather's 4 things. She had 3 of them already working in her favor. The 4th one, time. She had a feeling, lying there in the dark, with the wind moving over the stone above her, was about to run a great deal shorter than she had planned. March came in dry. Not just dry, wrong dry. The kind of dry that makes old men squint at the sky and shake their heads and not say what they're thinking, because saying it makes it real, and nobody in this valley was ready yet for it to be real. Cordelia noticed it first in the stake. She'd driven it into the creek bank back in January, down near the base of the ridge, and scratched a mark into the wood each week to track the water line. A small habit. Her grandfather's habit, really. Watch the small thing long enough, he used to say, and it will tell you the big thing before anybody else notices. By the 2nd week of March, the marks told a story nobody in Larkspur Flat wanted to hear yet. The creek had dropped 4 inches. In March, when it should have been running high off the last of the snow melt, swollen and loud, and impossible to ignore. It wasn't loud. It was barely a whisper over the stones. Cordelia stood at the bank that morning with Wren strapped against her chest, watching the thin brown water move slow and reluctant across rock that should have been fully submerged, and she felt the same cold certainty settle into her that had settled in back in February. The night Boone told her about the water. The night everything on this ridge stopped being merely about survival and started being about something much larger and far more dangerous. It's low, Ezra said, standing beside her. 15 now. His birthday had come and gone quietly in January, marked with cornbread and not much else, because there hadn't been much else to mark it with. For March. It's really low. I know. Is this the drought Grandpa wrote about? Cordelia didn't answer right away. She crouched at the bank, touched the water. Cold. Thin. Wrong. I think it might be starting, she said. I think it might be worse than what he wrote about. Worse how? She stood up, looked north, toward the high hills, where the Circle C range spread out fat and green even now, even in a season when everything else in the valley was already turning brittle at the edges. I think, she said slowly, somebody's making it worse. She went up alone 2 days later. Didn't tell Ezra where she was going. Told him to mind Ren, mind the terraces, mind the goats they'd traded for. Over the winter, 3 of them now, cheap, from a family that could no longer afford to keep them fed. Told him she'd be back before dark. She lied about that last part. She knew it when she said it. Some lies you tell, because you have to, because the truth would only worry somebody who couldn't do anything about the worrying except carry it around uselessly. The climb up the eastern rim took most of the morning. Steeper ground than Hallow Ridge. Rockier. The kind of terrain that made a woman's legs burn and her breath come short, and her mind, despite the effort, keeps circling back to the same question over and over. Where does the water go? Because that was the whole thing now. That was the only thing that mattered. Because if the creek feeding half the valley's wells was dropping in March, when it should have been at its highest, then something upstream was taking more than its share. And there was only one operation upstream large enough to take that much. She crested the last ridge just past noon and stopped. Stopped because the answer was right there in front of her, sitting in the landscape, as plain as a scar on a man's face, and she'd walked 2 hours to find it. And now that she had, she almost didn't want to look at it directly. A dam. Not a small one. Not a beaver's accidental work of sticks and mud. A built thing. Deliberate. Log and packed earth, maybe 8 feet high, spanning the narrow throat of the high creek, where it came down off the rim, before splitting, should have split, into 2 channels. One running south toward Larkspur Flat, one running north toward the Circle C Range. Except it wasn't splitting anymore. The dam had redirected nearly the whole flow north, toward Calloway's cattle, toward Calloway's grass, toward a ranch that had never once, in all the years Cordelia had lived in this valley, shown a single sign of struggling, through a dry season the way every small farm around it struggled year after year. Because now she knew why. Because it was right there, right in front of her. Water that should have belonged to an entire valley, quietly, patiently, redirected to feed one man's fortune, while everyone else prayed to a sky that had nothing to do with their trouble. She stood there a long moment, feeling something rise and harden inside her that wasn't quite anger yet. Something colder than anger. Something that felt, if she was honest with herself, almost like relief. The specific relief of finally seeing the shape of a thing you'd only been able to feel the edges of in the dark. She walked the length of the dam, studied the construction, noted the age of the timber. Not new. This hadn't happened last week. This had been standing here for years, patient, doing its quiet work, while an entire valley of farmers blamed the sky above their heads instead of the man behind the hills. And near the base, half hidden under a tangle of brush, she found something else. A survey stake. Old. Weathered gray. Government issue, the kind used to mark water rights claims filed with the county. She pulled it free. Turned it over in her hands. There was a date stamped into the metal collar, faint, but legible if a person knew exactly where to look. 1847. Her breath caught, because that was the same year. The same year her grandfather had surveyed Hallow Ridge. The same year he'd filed. She was almost sure of it now, though she'd have to go home and check the notebooks to be certain. A water rights claim of his own, one she'd read about in passing years ago, and never fully understood the weight of, because at 12 years old a person doesn't understand the weight of paperwork. They understand the weight of a grandfather's voice telling them a story by lamplight. Except this wasn't a story anymore. This was a stake. In the ground. With a date on it that predated Reeves Calloway's arrival in this county by 20 years, by every account she'd ever heard about the man's history here. Which meant something. She wasn't yet certain exactly what, but it meant something, and she intended to find out precisely what before this was finished. She didn't go home before dark. She rode, borrowed Tobias Lang's mule, the first favor she'd asked of anybody in this valley since burying Thaddeus, and Tobias hadn't asked why, just handed over the lead rope and told her to bring it back before Sunday, straight to the Circle C Ranch house. It sat low and long against the base of the northern hills, whitewashed, prosperous, the kind of house that told a person everything about a man's fortunes before he ever opened his mouth to speak. Cattle grazed fat and unbothered in pastures that should have been brown by now, should have been struggling the way every other pasture in the county was struggling, and weren't. She rode straight up to the front of it. Didn't wait to be announced. Didn't knock politely, and wait on the porch like a woman asking a favor. She was not asking a favor. Reeves Calloway came out, onto the porch, before she'd even swung down off the mule. Tall man, silver at the temples. The kind of stillness that comes from a lifetime of never having to raise his voice to get what he wanted, because there had always been somebody else willing to do the raising for him. Mrs. Doyle. He said her name like he was tasting something he wasn't sure he liked. This is a surprise. I doubt that. His eyebrows lifted just slightly. Excuse me? I don't think you're surprised at all. She stayed mounted. Didn't dismount. Kept the height. Kept whatever small advantage it gave her, because she suspected, correctly, as it would turn out, that every conversation with this man was a quiet negotiation over who stood taller. I found the dam. Something shifted behind his eyes. A flicker, gone fast, but she caught it. I don't know what you're referring to, he said finally. You do. Mrs. Doyle. There's a stake up there. Government survey stake. Dated 1847. Cordelia kept her voice level. Cold. The way she'd learned to keep it level, standing over a grave 5 months ago, with a whole town watching to see if she'd break. Same year my grandfather surveyed the ridge you tried to buy for $400, before I ever set foot on it. Something shifted in Calloway's face again. Small. Fast. Gone almost before it arrived. But she saw it, and this time she was sure she'd seen it. I don't know what you think you found, he said, and his voice had changed too, dropped lower, carrying something underneath the calm now that hadn't been there a moment before. But I'd be careful throwing around accusations you can't prove. I'm not accusing you of anything yet. I'm telling you what I found. What I do with it, Cordelia said, depends on what happens next. He stepped down off the porch, walked toward her, slow, deliberate, the walk of a man used to closing distance and having people give ground the moment he did it. She didn't give ground. Held the mule still. Held his eyes. You're a young woman, Calloway said, who's had a very hard year. I understand grief does strange things to a mind. Makes people see conspiracies where there's only bad luck and a dry season. That dam isn't bad luck. That dam, Calloway said, and now the calm was gone entirely, replaced with something flatter, harder, is on my range. Built by my men. For my cattle. Same as any rancher in this county has the right to manage water on his own land. It's not your land the water was ever supposed to reach. Water rights in this territory go to whoever can prove first and best use. He was close now. Close enough that Cordelia could see the muscle working steadily in his jaw. I've been running cattle on that range for 20 years. That's my proof. My grandfather filed a claim in 1847, 20 years before you ever set foot in this county. The silence that followed lasted long enough that Cordelia counted her own heartbeats through it. 1, 2, 3. I'd be very careful, Calloway said finally, quiet now. Quiet in a way that was somehow worse than shouting would ever have been about what you think an old man's notebook proves in a court of law, Mrs. Doyle. Paper claims from 30 years back have a way of getting lost, getting disputed, getting expensive to defend for a woman with no money and a baby on her hip and a brother who ought to be in school instead of digging holes in a rock. Cordelia felt her whole body go cold, and still, the specific stillness of a woman deciding, in real time, not to let a threat land the way it was designed to land. Is that a warning, Mr. Calloway? It's a fact. Facts don't usually come with a look on a man's face like the one you're wearing right now. Something almost like respect flickered behind his eyes then. Almost. Buried fast under something colder. Get off my land, he said. It's not your land I'm worried about. She turned the mule, rode off at a walk, unhurried, refusing him the satisfaction of watching her leave in a hurry, and it wasn't until she was well past the ranch gate, well out of sight of that whitewashed porch, that her hands finally started shaking on the lead rope. Because she'd just done something she couldn't undo. Because she'd walked into the den of a man with 20 years and a whole county's worth of power behind him, and told him plainly she knew what he'd built and dared him to do something about it. And underneath the fear, because there was fear, real fear, she wasn't foolish enough to pretend otherwise. There was something else too. Something that felt, strange as it was, almost like her grandfather's voice speaking quietly in her ear. You've got him worried now, Cordelia. Which meant she was right. Which meant this was only the beginning. She told Ezra everything that night. All of it. The dam. The stake. Calloway's face. The threat that hadn't sounded like a threat until you replayed it 3 times in your head and understood exactly what he'd meant by expensive to defend. Ezra sat very still, through the whole telling, the firelight moving across a face that had aged more in the last 5 months than it should have aged in 5 years. He threatened you, Ezra said when she finished. Flat. Not a question at all. He implied things. Cordelia. He never called her by her name, unless he meant to be taken seriously. He threatened you. Yes, she admitted. He did. Ezra stared into the fire a long moment. What do? We keep building, Cordelia said. We keep proving what this land is worth on its own terms, not his. And we find out exactly what our grandfather filed in 1847, because I have a feeling that piece of paper is worth more than anything either of us has ever held in our hands before. And if he comes after us? Cordelia looked at her brother, at the baby asleep in the basket by the fire, at the chamber walls around them, warm, solid, built by their own 2 pairs of hands out of a cliff nobody else had wanted. Then he'll find out, she said quietly, that we don't scare as easy as he's used to. Word travels fast in a small valley, faster than water, sometimes, and twice as hard to redirect once it's moving downhill on its own. By the end of March, half of Larkspur Flat knew that Cordelia Doyle had ridden onto the Circle C ranch and accused Reeves Calloway to his face of stealing the valley's water. Some of them laughed at it. Some of them, for the first time, stopped laughing, because the creek kept dropping. And now that somebody had said the thing out loud, the thing everybody had been quietly wondering and nobody had dared to actually say, the farmers up and down the valley started looking at their own wells with new eyes. Started comparing notes over fence lines. Started doing, in their own slow and stubborn way, exactly what Cordelia had already done alone on a cold morning in February. Tobias Lang came up the ridge himself in the first week of April. Big man. Ran the largest wheat operation in the valley. Didn't waste words, because wasting words wasn't in his nature. Your creek stake, he said, without preamble, standing at the base of the ledge, with his hat in his hands. The one you've been marking since January. What about it? I want to see it. She showed him. Walked him down to the bank. Showed him the marks scratched into the wood, week by week, the water line dropping steadier and faster than any March drought had any right to drop it. Tobias studied the stake a long time. Longer than the marks alone should have required. My well's down 8 feet, since February, he said finally, quiet, like the admission cost him something real. Hadn't told anybody that. Didn't want folks thinking I couldn't manage my own land. You're not the only one. I know that now. He looked up toward the northern hills, toward the fat green pastures visible even from here, even from this distance, mocking every brown and struggling field in the valley below. Is it true what you told him? About the dam? It's true. Tobias was quiet a long moment. I've known Reeves Calloway 12 years, he said. Thought I knew what kind of man he was. He shook his head slowly. Guess I didn't know him at all. Nobody does, Cordelia said. That's rather the point of a man like him. By May, the drought had a name. Not an official one. Just the name the valley gave it. Passed farmer to farmer, wife to wife. The way bad news always finds its own shorthand eventually. The dry year. Some called it worse than that. The creek at the ford ran barely an inch deep. Dust rose off Tate's south field on mornings, with no wind at all, which meant the ground had gone hard enough to shed a cultivator like water off a duck's back. And up on Hallow Ridge, Cordelia's terraces kept producing. Not abundantly, not enough to feed a valley, but steadily, the way things produce, when they've been built for hard conditions instead of hoped into being under easy ones. People noticed that too. Nora Kessler came up more and more often as the spring wore on. Brought her own hands. Started helping with the terraces without ever being asked, the way some people simply pitch in because standing around watching feels worse than working. Hank won't say it, Nora told her one afternoon, both of them elbow deep in composted soil, working it into the 3rd terrace row. But he's scared, Cordelia. Whole town's scared. Nobody wants to admit it, because admitting it makes it real. I know. You knew before any of us. Cordelia didn't answer that right away, kept working the soil, because there was a version of this conversation where she said, yes, I knew, my grandfather knew 30 years before that, and everyone who ever laughed at him for knowing it owes him an apology they'll never get the chance to give. And there was a version where she just kept her hands moving and let the silence say what it needed to say instead. She chose silence. What happens if it doesn't rain? Nora asked, quieter now. Then it gets worse. Before it gets better, Cordelia said. But it will get better. Eventually. It always does. You sound very sure of that. I'm sure of the parts one can control. Cordelia sat back on her heels, looked out at the valley, at the brown creeping further, into fields that should have been green by now. The rest of it, I just have to be ready for. June brought the first real cracks. Not in the ground, though there were plenty of those too, but in the people. The Hanley family, 5 children, the youngest not yet 2 years old, ran out of stored flour in the second week of June. Word of it reached Cordelia, through Boone, who'd started riding up more openly now, no longer bothering to disguise the visits, as chance encounters on his patrol route, because there wasn't much left to disguise. Calloway's suspicion had already landed. There wasn't a version of careful left that would undo it now. Della Hanley came into town asking for work, Boone said, sitting on the flat stone that had, without either of them ever discussing it out loud, become his stone. The one he always sat on. The one Ezra had started calling Boone's Rock, without a trace of irony. Sweeping, cleaning, anything that'd buy flour at Pruitt's counter. What did Pruitt do? Gave her what credit he could, which isn't much. His own shelves are thinning out. Supply wagons can't get through half the roads, dry ruts deep enough to break an axle. Boone rubbed the back of his neck. It's not just the Hanleys, Cordelia. There's children in this valley going to bed hungry. It's not a theory anymore. It's just what's happening. Cordelia sat with that a long moment, felt the weight of it settle into her, the way weight settles into ground already carrying more than it was built for. Because she had food. Not much, but some. Terraces producing. Goat milk. Dried beans stored since winter. And because she also knew, had known, since March, since the moment she'd understood exactly what that dam was taking and who it was taking it from, that charity alone wouldn't fix what was broken here. A week's worth of shared flour wouldn't rebuild a water table. Wouldn't undo 20 years of one man quietly redirecting a valley's entire future into his own pasture. I need to think, she said. About what? About how to fix this properly. Not just feed people through this month. Fix it. Boone looked at her a long moment. Something in his face she was starting to recognize now. The particular look of a man who'd spent 4 years working for Reeves Calloway and was beginning, slowly, painfully, to understand exactly what kind of man he'd been working for all along. Whatever you're thinking, he said, I want to help. You work for him. I work for wages, Boone said. That's different from working for what he believes in. The town meeting happened in the Kessler house. First week of July, 9 people crowded into a parlor too small for the size of the problem they'd come there to discuss. Cordelia sat in the straight-back chair by the window, with her grandfather's notebooks stacked on her knee, the way she'd have carried a weapon into a fight, if weapons were the kind of thing this particular fight called for. They weren't. Not yet. She told them everything. The dam, the stake, the date, Calloway's threat, though she softened the exact wording of it, because there was a version of the truth that served the room, and a version that only served her own anger, and she'd learned, over the winter, the difference between the two. With respect, Mrs. Doyle. Barnaby Pruitt, standing near the fireplace, arms crossed, the same posture he'd worn at Thaddeus's funeral supper 8 months ago, when he'd told her this wasn't the day to build a future on a dead man's notebooks. That's a serious accusation against a man with a great deal of standing in this county. It's not an accusation. It's what I found. You found a survey stake, with a date on it, that predates his arrival by 20 years. Pruitt's jaw worked. Even if that's true, proving intent in a court of law is a different matter entirely than finding an old piece of metal in the ground. I'm aware of that. Cordelia kept her voice level, which is why I'm not proposing we take this to a court of law tonight. I'm proposing we do the one thing Reeves Calloway can't argue with, which is build our own water system, reservoirs, terraces on the high ground, a shared cistern network fed by the spring seams on the eastern rim, The ones on my land, not his. We stop needing what he's taken, and we build something no court, no dam, no man with 20 years of standing can ever take away from us. Silence, then. Not the doubtful silence of before. A different quality of quiet altogether. The quiet of people running arithmetic in their heads and not finding a comfortable answer, but finding, for the first time, a possible one. Tobias Lang spoke first. How much labor? More than I have. I need this whole valley's hands, working together for however long it takes. And in exchange? Food from my stores, what there is of it, shared fairly, tracked honestly, while the work gets done. It's not a permanent fix. It's a bridge. Enough to get people through while we build the thing that actually lasts. Pruitt was quiet a long moment, looking at the notebooks on her knee, at the stakes she'd brought with her and set on the table like evidence in a trial that hadn't officially started yet. You're asking this town to trust you, he said finally, after everything that's been said about you this past year. I'm not asking you to trust me, Cordelia said. I'm asking you to come up and look at what I've already built. Then decide for yourselves. They came the next morning. Not all 9. 5, which was more than Cordelia had let herself expect, and she noted, with something close to quiet satisfaction, that Pruitt was among them. She walked them through everything without performance, without dressing it up for effect. Showed them the chambers, explained the thermal mass. Walked them along the terraces, showed the retaining walls, the soil built up from nothing over 8 months of hard, patient labor. Showed them the cistern, half-built but already holding water at the base, water that hadn't come from any creek Reeves Calloway controlled. Tobias Lang was the one who understood it first. She watched it happen on his face. The moment the pieces connected, the moment his own dying wheat crop and his own dropping well and this stranger's stubborn cliff homestead all folded together into a single, undeniable shape. If we'd had this, he said quietly, standing at the cistern edge, looking down into water that shouldn't have existed in a drought this severe, we could have kept the wheat alive. Probably, Cordelia said. He was quiet a long moment. Looked out at the valley below, then back at her. What do you need first? She'd been thinking about almost nothing else for days. Had a sequence already forming in her mind. What needed doing first, what would matter fastest, what would matter longest, into the years ahead. A reservoir, she said. On the valley floor. Big enough to catch whatever rain does come. So we're not losing every drop of it to hardpan ground. That can't absorb fast enough. 2 weeks of hard labor. A good crew. Horses. Tobias nodded slowly. I've got 6 men still with me. They need work. They need to eat. He paused. Where do you want it? She pointed to a shallow depression on the valley floor, visible even from up here, a low point in the terrain her grandfather had marked on his own survey map 30 years before, patient, waiting all that time for somebody to finally read it right. There, she said. Clay underneath. It'll hold once we shape the basin properly. Tobias looked at it a long moment. Did his own arithmetic, the labor, the time, his crew, the odds against them. All right, he said. I'm in. Cordelia looked at Pruitt, who'd been standing a little apart, listening, watching the water in the cistern, with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Something that on a different man might have looked like shame. Mr. Pruitt. He turned. He was quiet a long moment. And when he finally spoke, his voice had lost most of the certainty it had carried at Thaddeus's funeral, back when he told her plainly this wasn't the day to build a future on a dead man's notebooks. I'll open what remains of my store stock to a common pool, he said, and I'll put out word the town meets tomorrow night. I'll ask them to listen to you. Thank you. He hesitated, looked at the water in the cistern, at the terraces, at everything built on a piece of ground he'd once called worthless, with the full confidence of a man who'd never once in his life been seriously wrong about anything. I owe you an apology, he said. I suspect you already know that. It can wait, Cordelia said. Right now I need your wagon and your store inventory. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. Close enough to one. I'll have the wagon ready by morning. The work began the first week of July. 31 people at the base of the eastern rim on that first sunrise, more than Cordelia had expected and fewer than she needed, and it went about as smoothly as 31 strangers with different skills and different tempers ever managed to go, which is to say, not smoothly at all. Because there's always a Dutch Briggs. He arrived that first morning, with his arms crossed, and a question loaded, and ready before a single shovel had broken ground. "Who put her in charge?" he said, not quietly, to the group generally, the way a man talks when he's been holding a grievance and finally found an audience willing to hear it. The crew went still. A few people looked at their feet. Cordelia looked at him directly. "Nobody," she said. "You can all go home if you'd like. The land's mine. The survey's mine. If you want access to what we're building, this is how it works. If you've got a better plan, Mr. Briggs, I'm genuinely listening." Dutch looked like he'd expected more of a fight. Got the arithmetic instead, cold and plain, and didn't quite know what to do with it. "I just think there ought to be a vote," he muttered, quieter now, "about who's running this." "Dutch," Tobias, from behind him, voice carrying the particular weariness of a man who'd known Dutch Briggs 20 years and was running short on patience for this particular routine. "She's the one who's had food and water this whole year, while the rest of us watched our wells go dry. Let her run it." That ended it. Not because Dutch was satisfied. Cordelia could see plainly he wasn't, but because the people around him had already done the arithmetic themselves, and arguing was costing time nobody could spare that summer. She divided the crews. Tobias's men to the reservoir, with the horses and heavy tools. Younger men from town to the upper slope, with Ezra starting the third cistern. The women, Nora leading them, without being asked, the way some people simply step into leadership because the moment requires it and nobody else has, to the compost operation the valley's fields would need before any of this could actually recover. By noon, Cordelia had a headache and a blister rubbed raw on her heel, and one young man sitting on a rock, with his leg elevated after catching his own shin, with a mattock, his friend arguing loudly about whether it needed a doctor. It was not smooth. It was not organized. It was 31 people with 31 different ideas about what they were doing and why, trying to execute a plan most of them hadn't had time to fully understand before the shovel started moving. There were moments, that first week, when Cordelia looked at the state of 3 separate work sites at once and felt something close to despair. Not the deep kind, the practical kind. The kind where a person adds up what's been done against what still needs doing, and the numbers refuse to offer any comfort. She didn't let it show. She kept moving. It found its rhythm by the second week. Not because the problems disappeared, they didn't, but because people started understanding their piece of the whole, and understanding your piece, even a hard and unglamorous piece, changes the way a person carries it through a long day. The reservoir was the center of everything. Largest work. Most visible. A basin taking shape by degrees, 20 feet across, 8 feet deep at its lowest point, with a clay-packed berm rising on the downhill side. That would, if it held, catch whatever rain finally came instead of losing it to hardpan ground the way every previous rain that year already had been lost. Tobias Lang ran that crew well. New horses, new grade, told his men what he needed, noticed when they'd delivered it, didn't waste energy on anything else. Cordelia found herself checking in with him less as the days passed, which was a relief, because there were 9 other things needing her attention at any given hour of daylight. The compost work was slower, less visible, but in her own estimation, the most important thing happening on any of the 3 sites, because the valley soil had been dying for years, not just this season, and a person couldn't fix that kind of damage fast, but a person could start, and starting now meant the amendment would have time to work into the ground before whatever rain eventually came. Nora Kessler ran that operation without ever once asking Cordelia's permission to run it. Just showed up with a wheelbarrow and her sleeves rolled and started organizing the other women into rotations, and by the end of the first week there were 11 of them working the piles, and it was Nora, not Cordelia, who sorted out the food distribution problem when the whole system started coming apart under the weight of real-world implementation. Because Cordelia had imagined it too simply. A central point at Pruitt's store. Daily rations based on hours worked. What she hadn't imagined was the bookkeeping, who'd worked a full day versus a half day, how to account for a mother who couldn't work because her child was sick, whether a merchant contributing store stock counted the same as a man swinging a shovel from sunup. She came back to town on the evening of the 6th day to find 3 families arguing outside Pruitt's store, voices raised, Pruitt in the middle of it looking like a man who'd agreed to referee a game, whose rules had changed, without anybody telling him. "This isn't working," he said, low, when Cordelia got close enough. "I see that. Nora." Cordelia turned. "Can you manage the books properly? Daily records. Everyone who works, how long, what they've contributed. Transparent, so anybody can check it themselves." Nora looked at her, startled. "I kept my father's store accounts for 6 years, before I married Hank." "Good. I'm putting it in your hands. What you decide is fair, stands." Nora glanced at Pruitt, who had the grace not to object. It wasn't perfect after that. Nothing about that summer was perfect. But it was functional. And functional, that year, was worth considerably more than perfect had ever been worth in any easier season. Which brings us to the part of this story Cordelia thought, for a long time afterward, marked the real turning point. Not the reservoir. Not the town meeting. Not even the dam itself. It was the 9th day, when Dutch Briggs quit. He found her at the reservoir site mid-morning. Told her he was pulling his labor. That he didn't believe the reservoir plan would work. That they were spending energy on something long-term, when what people needed was short-term help, and that he'd decided to take his family south to his wife's relatives, until the drought broke, however long that took. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said only, "I think you're making the wrong decision. I'm not going to try and stop you." He looked like he'd expected more resistance. "The cisterns," he said, quieter now, his hat turning, over and over in his hands. "If I come back after, will there be access? For my family?" Cordelia looked at him a long moment. There was a version of this, where she reminded him exactly what he'd said, standing on this same slope in April, calling her a cliff which loud enough for the whole crew to hear. There was a version, where she let him feel, just once, the particular sting of being turned away the way he'd once tried to turn her away. She didn't reach for that version. "Yes," she said. "If you come back, there's a place for you. We're building this for the whole valley, Dutch. Not just the people who believed in it from the very start." He nodded, looked smaller, somehow, than he had 9 days earlier, standing on this same ground asking who'd put her in charge. He left that afternoon. Wagon loaded. And Cordelia watched him go, from the ridge, and then went back to work, because there was always more work, and grief and doubt, and every other complicated feeling had learned, over the last 8 months, to wait their turn behind the shovel in her hands. Boone was there every day now, not hiding it anymore, not bothering with the fiction of a wandering patrol route that happened to pass near the reservoir, which meant, inevitably, that Calloway found out. It happened on a Thursday, deep in July, the reservoir nearly 2 weeks along, the berm solid on 3 sides. Boone rode up to the site that afternoon with a look on his face that Cordelia recognized before he'd said a single word. The look of a man carrying something he didn't want to be the one carrying up this particular hill. "Calloway knows," he said, "about the work up here. About me being part of it." Cordelia's stomach dropped, slow and cold. "What did he say?" "Told me to stop." Boone's jaw was tight. "Told me if I kept coming up here, I could find work somewhere else." And he looked at her a long moment. Something steady in his face that hadn't been there the first day she'd met him, back in December, a stranger on a tired gray horse offering to fix a keystone angle for reasons he claimed not to fully understand himself. "And I told him I'd already decided which work mattered more to me." Cordelia felt her chest tighten. "Boone, don't." He held up a hand, gentle but firm. "Don't talk me out of it. I've been riding that man's range for years, watching him take more than his share and calling it good business. I'm done pretending I didn't see it happening right under my own boots. He'll fire you. Probably. You'll have nowhere to." "Cordelia." He said her name the way he had, that first time, back in February, like a door opening in a house he'd thought was empty. "I've got 2 hands, and a good back, and more carpentry sense than half this crew combined. I'll find work. What I won't find twice is a chance to build something that actually matters instead of just protecting one man's cattle." She didn't have an answer for that. Not one that came out as words, anyway. What she had instead was a feeling rising in her that she hadn't let herself name yet, not fully, not out loud. Something that had been building slow since a cold December morning, when a stranger on a tired horse had looked at her ridge and seen not a foolish widow's folly, but a keystone cut wrong that he knew, without being asked, exactly how to fix. She reached out, took his hand, just for a moment, just long enough. "Thank you," she said. He didn't let go right away. Wasn't doing it for thanks, he said, quiet. "I know. Was doing it because." He stopped himself, looked away, toward the reservoir, toward the berm rising slow and solid against a drought that had already taken more from this valley than any of them had been ready to lose. He never finished the sentence. Cordelia noticed that too, filed it away, the same careful way she filed away everything that mattered and wasn't yet ready to be spoken aloud in the daylight. Calloway fired him 2 days later. Boone showed up at the ridge that evening with a bedroll over one shoulder and nowhere else to be, and Cordelia understood, watching him climb the track in the fading light, that something had shifted permanently. That whatever careful balance had existed between the Circle C Ranch and Hallow Ridge, watchful, suspicious, but not yet openly hostile, had just broken clean in half. He didn't even argue, Boone said, dropping the bedroll near the fire. "Just told me to collect my wages and clear out by sundown. I'm sorry." "Don't be." He sat down heavily. "First time in 4 years I've slept easy about where my wages come from." Amos Whitcomb, up that week checking the keystone work on the 4th chamber, snorted from his seat near the fire. "Man quits a rich man's payroll to sleep in a rock with a widow and her children. County's going to have quite a lot to say about that." "County's already had quite a lot to say about everything," Cordelia said. "Doesn't seem to have slowed anybody down yet." Amos laughed at that. Real laugh. The kind that made his shoulders shake despite the ache Cordelia knew lived permanently in his knees. But underneath the laughter, later that night, after Amos had gone, and Ezra was asleep, and Wren was quiet in her basket, Cordelia sat by the fire with Boone and felt the weight of what was actually happening settle over both of them like a second, heavier blanket. Because a man like Reeves Calloway didn't just let something like this go, didn't just accept a lost hand and a lost dam-keeper's silence and move on quietly with his ranching. "He's going to do something," Cordelia said quietly. "Isn't he?" Boone was quiet a long moment, staring into the fire. "Yes," he said finally. "I think he is." It happened on the last night of July. A storm had been building all afternoon. Real weather. Finally, the first serious clouds the valley had seen in months, thick and dark, and moving in off the mountains, with a wind that smelled like rain even, though nobody quite believed, after so many false promises, that spring, that any of it would actually fall. Cordelia felt it before she heard it. A wrongness in the air. The particular stillness, that comes right before something breaks. She was outside the 2nd chamber, banking the fire low against the coming wind, when Ezra's voice cut through the dark. "Cordelia." Something in his tone brought her upright immediately. "What?" "Riders. Coming up the track." She went to the ledge edge, looked down into the dark, and there, moving fast, torches lit despite the wind trying to snuff them, for horses climbing the switchback trail toward Hallow Ridge, with a speed that had nothing to do with a friendly visit, she saw them. Her blood went cold. "Get Wren into the back chamber," she said. "Steady. Fast. Now, Ezra. What about you?" "Now." He went. She heard him moving fast behind her, heard Wren startle awake and cry out at the sudden jostling, and Cordelia stood alone at the edge of the ledge, with the wind pulling at her skirt and 4 torches climbing toward her out of the dark. Boone came out of the 1st chamber, already reaching for the old hammer that lived by the door, not a weapon exactly, but the only thing close to one they kept up here. "Cordelia, stay back," she said. "Let me see who it is first." "That's not Boone." She turned to him, and whatever he saw in her face made him stop arguing. "If this is what I think it is, then the last thing that helps is you standing in front of me looking like exactly the man Calloway just fired for defying him. Let me talk first." The riders reached the base of the ledge and stopped. 4 of them. She recognized one, a foreman from the Circle C, a broad man named Coulter she'd seen once or twice in town. The others were strangers to her, hired hands, the kind of men a rancher keeps around for exactly this sort of night. "Mrs. Doyle." Coulter's voice carried up easy, over the wind, too easy, the practiced casualness of a man delivering a threat, and calling it a conversation. Mr. Calloway sends his regards. Does he? Says it'd be a shame. Coulter's torch threw jumping shadows across his face. Terrible dry summer. Terrible easy for a fire to start up here. All this timber. All this brush. Wouldn't take much. Cordelia felt her heart slam once, hard, against her ribs. And then something else took over. Something colder. Something that had been building in her since a Tuesday in October when they'd buried her husband, and the whole town had already decided what to do with the rest of her life. She was done letting other people decide. You tell Mr. Calloway, she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, steady enough that even Coulter's torch seemed to still for a moment, that there's a survey stake dated 1847 sitting in my chamber right now, and a stack of notebooks that prove exactly what that dam is taking and from whom and for how long. Coulter's easy smile faltered, just slightly. You tell him, Cordelia went on, that if so much as one spark touches this ridge tonight, every one of you standing at the bottom of it right now becomes a witness to arson against a widow and 2 children. And I will ride to the county seat myself and make sure every judge, every newspaper, every rancher in this territory knows exactly what kind of man sent you up here to say it. Just the wind. Just the torches snapping in the gusts, holding their breath along with everyone else. Then, behind her, she heard boots on stone. Boone stepped up beside her. Then Amos Whitcomb, cane and all, having refused to leave earlier than he'd planned despite the coming storm, standing at her other shoulder, with an expression that dared any of them to try something, with an old man watching. And then more. Tobias Lang's lantern, coming up the far side of the track. He'd been staying the night to finish reservoir measurements, before the storm, hadn't left yet, and now here he was, climbing fast toward the sound of trouble. For riders looked at a widow, an old stonemason, a fired ranch hand, and a wheat farmer standing shoulder to shoulder on a cliff ledge in the building wind, and something in the arithmetic of the night shifted decisively. Coulter's torch dropped a few inches. We were just delivering a message, ma'am. Message received, Cordelia said. Now ride back down, and tell your employer I'll be seeing him again. On my terms this time. The riders held a moment longer. Then, one by one, they turned their horses and started back down the switchback, torches bobbing away, into the dark, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall, slow at first, then faster, hissing against the torches still visible far below, until the whole valley seemed to exhale at once. Cordelia stood at the edge of the ledge, rain soaking through her dress, her whole body shaking now, that there was no one left to see it shake, and Boone's hand found her shoulder, steady, warm, saying without words everything he hadn't finished saying 2 days before. You didn't have to stand out here alone, he said quietly, close enough that only she could hear it, over the rain. I wasn't planning on staying alone. He looked at her. Something passed between them in the dark, in the rain, in the wreckage of a threat that hadn't landed the way it was meant to. No, he agreed. I don't suppose you were. Behind them, inside the second chamber, Wren's crying had already settled into something closer to sleep, and Ezra stood in the entrance watching the last of the torches disappear down the mountain, 15 years old, and understanding, in that moment, something about his sister that he would carry with him the rest of his life. She didn't run. She never ran. And out over the valley, for the first time in 9 months, the rain kept falling, thin and uncertain, and nowhere near enough to break the drought that had gripped Larkspur Flat since spring. But it was rain. It was a start. And somewhere down at the base of the mountain, for torches rode back toward a ranch house, where a man was about to learn that the widow he'd tried to frighten off a worthless cliff had just become the one thing he'd never planned for. An opponent who wouldn't be moved. The letter came the following Monday, delivered by the county sheriff himself, which told Cordelia everything, before she'd even broken the seal. Because Reeves Calloway didn't send sheriffs to deliver good news. He sent them to deliver weight. Official weight. The kind stamped and sealed and dressed up to look like law instead of what it actually was. Which was fear, wearing a badge for cover. She read it standing at the mouth of the second chamber, rain still dripping off the timber frame from the night before, the first real rain the valley had seen in 9 months, and somehow that made the letter worse. Because the timing wasn't an accident. Calloway had waited, until the exact moment things started turning in her favor. And then he'd struck. A civil claim, filed with the county court. Reeves Calloway, petitioner, versus the water improvements constructed on and originating from the property known as Hallow Ridge. He wasn't suing her for the land. He was suing for the water, claiming prior and continuous use of the eastern rim's flow dating back 20 years. Claiming the new reservoir, the cisterns, the whole system the valley had bled 2 months of sweat into building, constituted unlawful interference with an established water right. The hearing, the letter stated plainly, would be held in 3 weeks' time. Cordelia stood there in the wet morning light and felt something go very cold and very still inside her. Because if he won this, if a judge sided with 20 years of cattle grazing over a scrap of paper nobody had looked at in 3 decades, then everything they'd built, the reservoir, the cisterns, the terraces, the whole fragile, stubborn, hand-built future of this valley, belonged, legally, to a man who had already tried once to burn it clean off the mountain. Cordelia, Ezra's voice behind her. She hadn't heard him come up. What is it? She handed him the letter without a word. Watched his face change as he read it. Watched the 15-year-old boy who'd carved his sister a wooden rattle out of scrap barn timber disappear for a moment, replaced by someone older, someone who understood exactly what was being threatened here. He can't do this, Ezra said. He's doing it. The stake. The date. We told the sheriff. A stake in the ground isn't a filed claim, Ezra. Cordelia's voice was flat, steady. The voice she used when panic was circling close enough to touch, and she refused, absolutely refused, to let it land on her. Calloway's lawyer will say the stake could have been placed by anybody. Could mean anything. Could be nothing at all, without paperwork standing behind it. So what do we do? She looked down at the letter again. At the date set for the hearing, 3 weeks out, at the county seat, in front of a judge neither of them had ever met, and a room that would be filled, she already knew, without being told, with every person in Larkspur Flat who'd ever called her the Cliff Witch. We find the paperwork, she said. She went through the notebooks that night. All 17 of them, spread across the workbench in the second chamber by lamplight, Wren asleep in her basket, Ezra beside her turning pages, with the same careful reverence he'd learned from watching his sister do it 1,000 times before. Because somewhere in these pages, she was almost certain of it now, had been certain of it since the moment she'd pulled that weathered stake free of the brush on the eastern rim. Her grandfather had done more than just survey this land. He'd claimed it, formally, legally, in 1847, 20 years before Reeves Calloway had ever driven a single head of cattle onto this range. Except knowing a thing was true and proving it were 2 very different animals. And by midnight she'd worked through 9 notebooks without finding a single reference to a filed water claim. Just surveys, just sketches, just an old man's careful, patient observations about rock and water and the shape of a valley nobody else had bothered to really look at. Maybe it's not here, Ezra said, rubbing his eyes. Maybe he never actually filed it. Maybe he just meant to. Cordelia felt something twist tight in her stomach at that. Because it was possible. Grandfather Jonas had been many things, brilliant, stubborn, decades ahead of every surveyor who'd laughed at him. But he'd also been, by every account she'd ever heard, a man who trusted his own memory over paperwork more often than was wise. Keep looking, she said. They found it in the 14th notebook, close to 2 in the morning, when Ezra's eyes were nearly shut, and Cordelia had started reading more out of stubbornness than hope. A single page, folded twice, tucked between 2 survey sketches like her grandfather had wanted it protected, hidden, kept safe from anyone who might come looking for it before it was truly needed. A copy, in his own careful hand, of a filing made with the Territorial Land Office in the autumn of 1847. Water rights claim, Eastern Rim Spring Seams, and associated flow, filed under the name Jonas Hargrove. Cordelia's hands were shaking as she read it. Because there, at the bottom, in ink gone brown, with age but still perfectly legible, was a second signature. A witnessing clerk's stamp. Official. Dated. Real. Ezra. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. Ezra, wake up. Look at this. He leaned over her shoulder. Read it twice. Looked up at her, with an expression she'd never quite seen on his face before, something between disbelief and something that was almost, despite the late hour and the exhaustion and the terrifying weight of everything riding on the next 3 weeks, joy. He knew, Ezra said. He actually knew, and he filed it, and he never told anybody, and everybody called him crazy anyway. He filed it, Cordelia said slowly, and then spent the rest of his life being laughed at by men who never once bothered to check the county records before they decided he was a fool. She sat back, held the page against her chest the way she might have held Wren. Outside, the rain had stopped sometime after midnight, and the ledge was quiet except for the small, steady drip of water still finding its way off the timber frame into the cistern below, doing exactly what she'd built it to do. This is it, she said. This is what beats him. The waiting that followed felt, in some ways, longer than the 9 months of building that had come before it, because now there was nothing left to dig, or chisel, or haul. The reservoir was finished. The cisterns were finished. The terraces were producing what they were going to produce this season, and there was no more work that could change the outcome of what a judge in the county seat would decide about a man's 20 years against her grandfather's 30. Boone stayed close through all of it. Didn't say much most days. Never had. That was part of what she'd come to trust about him. But he was there, every evening, sitting on the flat stone that had become his by unspoken agreement, watching the valley below, with her in the long silences that neither of them felt any need to fill. Whatever happens in that courtroom, he said one evening, doesn't change what you built up here. Doesn't unbuild it. Doesn't make it less true. It could take it away from us. Take it, not unbuild it. He looked at her steady. There's a difference, Cordelia. Even if we lose, what we know how to do doesn't leave with the land. She sat with that a long moment. You're better at this than you let on, she said. The comforting people part. Something almost like a smile crossed his face. Don't tell anybody. I've got a reputation to protect. What reputation is that? Quiet cowboy. Doesn't say much. Very mysterious. The smile deepened, just slightly. Ruins the whole effect. If word gets around I'm secretly good at this. She laughed. First time in weeks. And the sound of it, out there on the ledge in the cooling evening air, felt like something worth protecting all on its own. Whatever a courtroom 300 miles from any of this decided to say about paper and dates and dead men's claims. The hearing was held in the last week of August, in a courthouse room that filled up faster and fuller than any gathering Larkspur flat had produced since the funeral that had started this whole story 11 months before. Because everybody wanted to see it. That was the truth of it, unglamorous as it was. Some had come to see Cordelia Doyle vindicated. Some had come hoping to see her humbled instead, still holding on to whatever was left of the cliff which story they'd built her into over the winter. Most had simply come because the outcome of this hearing would decide whether the water system they'd all bled 2 months of summer building actually belonged to them, or whether Reeves Calloway would walk out of this courthouse owning it outright. Calloway sat at the front, with his lawyer, a sharp, city-dressed man from the territorial capital, and he did not look, Cordelia noted, like a man who expected to lose. She sat across the aisle, with Ezra beside her, Wren asleep against Nora Kessler's shoulder 2 rows back, and the 14th notebook resting on her knee like something sacred. Calloway's lawyer spoke first, laid out 20 years of continuous cattle operation, laid out the dam's construction, framed carefully as routine range management, nothing unusual, nothing anyone in this territory hadn't done a dozen times before. Laid out the danger, as he called it, of allowing unregulated construction upstream to threaten an established agricultural operation that employed dozens of families and fed half the beef market in the territory. It was, Cordelia had to admit, listening to it, a good argument. It was also, she reminded herself, wrong. When it was her turn, she didn't stand at first. Just sat there a moment, feeling the weight of every eye in that room, feeling Dutch Briggs's absence in the crowd. He hadn't come back yet, hadn't been seen, since the day he loaded his wagon and rode south. Feeling Barnaby Pruitt's presence instead, near the back, arms crossed, watching with an expression that had nothing left of the man who'd told her a year ago this wasn't the day to build a future on a dead man's notebooks. Then she stood, walked to the front, set the notebook page on the judge's bench. My grandfather, she said, was a surveyor. He walked the eastern rim of this valley in 1847. He filed a water claim with the Territorial Land Office that same year, 20 years before Mr. Calloway's operation began, drawing from that same source. The judge, an older man with tired eyes and the particular patience of somebody who'd sat through a great many disputes over water in a territory that never seemed to have enough of it, picked up the page. Studied it a long moment. "This is a copy," he said, "not the original filing. I understand that. I'd ask the court to confirm it against the Territorial Land Office records. The filing should still exist there, under Jonas Hargrove, dated autumn of 1847. Calloway's lawyer was already on his feet. "Your Honor, a 30-year-old copy transcribed by hand proves nothing without independent verification." "Then verify it," Cordelia said, cutting across him, her voice carrying clean through the courtroom in a way that made even Calloway's practiced stillness falter for half a second. "Send a writer to the Capitol. I'll wait as long as it takes. Because I'd rather this hearing take 3 more weeks than have this court decide something this important on 20 years of one man's convenience instead of the actual truth." The judge looked at her a long moment. Something in his tired eyes shifted, not quite a smile, but close to respect. "The court will adjourn," he said, "pending verification with the Territorial Land Office. 3 weeks. The writer came back on the 19th day, faster than anybody had dared expect. Cordelia was in the 3rd terrace, hands deep in composted soil, when she heard the hoofbeats coming up the track faster than any casual visit ever came. She stood, wiped her hands on her apron, and watched a young man from the sheriff's office climb the last stretch of trail with an envelope clutched in one hand. "Mrs. Doyle." He was out of breath. "Filings confirmed. Territorial Office found it. Jonas Hargrove. Autumn of 1847. It's all there, ma'am. Exactly like you said." Cordelia stood very still, because she'd believed it, had trusted it, the way she trusted every careful, patient page her grandfather had ever written. But believing and having it confirmed, having it stamped and sealed by strangers 300 miles away who had no reason to care one way or another whether Cordelia Doyle won or lost, that was different. That was a weight lifting she hadn't fully known she was still carrying. "Thank you," she said, and her voice came out rougher than she intended. The young rider handed over the envelope and turned his horse back down the track, and Cordelia stood there on the terrace, with dirt still under her fingernails, and her grandfather's vindication, 30 years overdue, finally arrived in her shaking hands. The second hearing came 3 weeks later, in the middle of September, and it was shorter than the first, because there wasn't much left to argue once the confirmed filing was entered into record. Calloway's lawyer tried, briefly, to raise questions about abandonment, whether a claim and used for 30 years could still hold legal weight, but the judge, reading through the confirmed document a second time, cut that argument off before it fully found its feet. "A claim doesn't expire," the judge said, simply because the man who filed it chose to observe rather than exploit what he'd claimed. Mr. Hargrove's survey notes, entered as supporting evidence, demonstrate continuous documented interest in this water source spanning decades before his granddaughter ever set foot on the property in question. He looked up, looked directly at Reeves Calloway, sitting stiff and pale at the front of the courtroom. "This court finds in favor of the respondent. The water improvements constructed on Hallow Ridge and the associated distribution system serving Larkspur Flat are found to be lawful, built upon a senior and valid claim. Mr. Calloway's petition is denied in full." The courtroom didn't erupt. Didn't need to. Instead, there was a long exhale, a room full of people who'd spent 2 months bleeding sweat into a reservoir finally allowed to believe it was actually, permanently, legally theirs. Cordelia sat very still, Ezra's hand gripping her shoulder from the row behind, and felt something in her finally, after 11 months, come fully undone. She didn't cry. She'd already done all her crying, back in October, alone in a rented room, with a baby asleep against her chest. What she felt now was different, quieter, something closer to the particular stillness of a woman who has spent a year being told, over and over, in 100 small cruelties, that she didn't belong on the ground she'd chosen, and has just been told, by a judge and a signed piece of paper, and 30 years of a dead man's patience, that she was right all along. Reeves Calloway stood, gathered his papers without a word, walked out of the courtroom, without once looking in Cordelia's direction. She never saw him again. The rain came properly in the first days of October, not the thin, uncertain drizzle of that stormy July night. Real rain. 3 days of it, steady and soaking, followed by a week dry, followed by 2 more days, that filled the reservoir past what Cordelia had thought its capacity could ever hold. The creek ran full at the ford for the first time in over a year. She stood on the bank the morning it happened, watching brown water move fast, over stones that had sat dry and cracked since spring, and she was not alone. Half the valley had come down to see it, drawn by the same instinct, the need to witness, with their own eyes, the thing they'd been waiting so long to believe in. Nora Kessler stood beside her, nodded once, the same direct, unsentimental nod she always gave, which was the shape her warmth took when words felt like too much for the moment. Amos Whitcomb leaned on his cane at the edge of the group, having made the walk down from his house despite knees that had no business allowing it. Your grandfather would have liked to see this, he said. He'd have said he told us so. Amos made a sound. That might have been a laugh. He did tell us so. Nobody listened. He looked at the water. That's always the trouble, isn't it? The person who's right is never the person anybody wants to listen to. Cordelia thought about that. About 30 years of notebooks nobody had opened. About a stake in the ground nobody had noticed. About a woman standing on a courthouse floor with a 30-year-old piece of paper that had just saved an entire valley's future. Maybe, she said. Or maybe the timing's just never right, until it is. Dutch Briggs came back in the middle of October. He appeared at the base of the cliff path on a gray morning, hat in his hands, looking like a man who'd rehearsed something a long way and had just arrived at the moment the rehearsal had to end. Mrs. Doyle, he said. Mr. Briggs. Heard about the hearing. Heard the whole valley came through better than anybody figured it would. It did. He was quiet a moment, turning his hat over. You said there'd be a place for me, if I came back. He looked up. Did you mean that? Cordelia looked at him a long moment. A big man making himself as small as he could manage, and she found, not for the first time, that year, more patience for it than she'd have guessed she had left in her. I meant it, she said. Your North Fields had a season's worth of rain sitting in it, and nobody's worked it yet. Nora can tell you what amendment it needs. Tobias can show you the rotation we've been running. She paused. There's work to do. There's always work to do. He nodded, put his hat back on, looked at the reservoir glinting below, at the terraces green, and full behind her, at the changed shape of a mountain he'd left in the middle of a drought, and returned to find transformed. The cliff which, he said, half to himself. That's what I called you. To my wife. To half this town. Get your seed in. Dutch, Cordelia said, not unkindly. The season's not waiting on either of us to finish feeling bad about the past. He almost smiled, turned, walked back toward the valley he'd nearly abandoned for good. Barnaby Pruitt came up in late October, with a folded document, and an expression Cordelia had learned to recognize by now. The look of a man who'd decided something needed doing, and had already done it, before anyone could talk him out of it. I want to give you something, he said, held out the paper. She unfolded it. A legal easement, drawn up and filed, with the county, formally guaranteeing every farming family in the valley permanent, protected access to the cistern system on Hallow Ridge. Documented. Binding. The kind of protection a handshake could never quite be. You had this drawn up, Cordelia said. 2 weeks ago. I know a good clerk. He looked out at the valley, green now where it had been bone brown for a year. Systems need to be written down to outlast the people who built them. You taught this whole valley that, Mrs. Doyle, whether you meant to or not. She folded the paper carefully. Thought about 17 notebooks that had sat in an oilskin bag for years, waiting for the right person, the right conditions, the right moment to finally matter. Thank you, she said. He nodded once. Neither of them said anything else about it, because there wasn't anything else that needed saying between them. Boone asked her in late October, close to a full year, after Thaddeus had been laid in the ground. He didn't make a production of it. That wasn't his way, and by then Cordelia had come to understand that his way, quiet, steady, saying only what needed saying and no more, was worth more to her than any amount of speeches could have been. They were sitting on his flat stone at dusk, the valley spread out below them healed, and green in a way it hadn't been in over a year, and he said, without any particular ceremony at all, "I've been thinking about staying up here permanent." "Have you?" Figure a man ought to say something like that plainly, instead of dancing around it. He looked at her. "I'd like to stay, Cordelia, not as a hired hand, or a favor, or a fired ranch man, with nowhere else to go. I'd like to stay, as your husband, if you'll have me." She looked at him a long moment. At this man who'd ridden up a track in December on a tired gray horse, and offered to fix a keystone for reasons he claimed not to fully understand, and had gone on, quietly, patiently, fixing every crooked thing he found on this ridge ever since the keystone, the water system, and somewhere along the way, without either of them quite noticing, when it happened, the broken shape of her own grief. "Yes," she said simply. He didn't say anything else, just reached over and took her hand, the way he had, that stormy night in July, and they sat there together on the flat stone, as the last light slipped off the ridge and the first stars came out, over a valley that had, against every prediction anyone in it had ever made, survived. They married on the ledge in November, exactly where it made sense to marry, because it was the only ground either of them had ever really wanted to stand on. It was not a large gathering. Tobias Lang and his wife brought a pot of stew that fed everyone twice over. Nora Kessler spent the week before quietly reorganizing the ledge's food stores with a thoroughness nobody had asked for, and everybody was grateful for. Amos Whitcomb made the climb in 40 minutes flat and sat on his usual stone with the expression of a man who had lived long enough to see things work out occasionally and was not going to pretend to be unmoved by it. Ezra stood beside his sister in a coat that actually fit him now, dark wool, quietly commissioned by Boone from the seamstress in town 3 weeks earlier, a secret kept from both Doyles until the morning of the wedding itself. Boone said what he meant to say. Cordelia said what she meant to say. Neither of them said anything they didn't mean, which struck her, standing there in the cold November light, with Wren asleep against Nora's shoulder, and the whole valley spread green and healed below them, as exactly the correct way to begin something meant to last. Years later, when people in Larkspur Flat told the story of the dry year, they told it different ways. Some called it the hard summer. Some called it the year of the cliff. The oldest among them still called Cordelia Doyle by the name her grandfather had used, decades before, for the particular kind of person who looks at a problem everyone else has already walked past and decides, without any guarantee it'll work, to stop walking. An observer. Somebody who pays attention long enough to see what's actually there, instead of only what everybody's already agreed to believe. On a morning in early spring, several seasons after the drought had settled into the category of stories rather than memories, Cordelia sat on the ledge with a new notebook open on her knee. Not her grandfather's, her own, writing down observations about the mountain snowpack to the north, about the water table beneath the valley floor, about a pattern in the data she was beginning to notice that she suspected, though she couldn't be entirely certain yet, might matter again someday. Boone came out of the chamber with 2 cups of coffee, set one down beside her, sat on his stone, the same stone, and looked out at a valley that now had terraces climbing its eastern slopes, and a reservoir 3 years seasoned and holding steady, and children growing up who understood, without ever having to be taught the hard way, exactly what a water table was and why it mattered. Ezra worked his own patch of terrace now, a few rows down, 20 years old, steady-handed, the boy in the too-big coat long, since grown into a man the whole valley trusted. Wren, 5 years old, sat nearby with a slate and a piece of chalk, copying letters her mother had shown her that morning, utterly unaware that she was, in her own small way, continuing something that had started 30 years before she was born. "What are you writing?" Boone asked. "An observation," Cordelia said. He looked toward the mountains. "Good or bad?" She thought about her grandfather, about notebooks nobody had been ready to read until the exact right moment finally arrived, about the distance between knowing something true and being in a position, at last, to do something about it. "Early," she said. "It's still early to say." She wrote it down. The morning light came over the eastern rim and spread across the valley below, and the terraces caught it, green and holding, and the reservoir held it too, calm and full in reflection, and the creek ran clean at the ford the way it was always meant to run. And the work, steady, imperfect, necessary, went on.